Have you noticed that a whole load of urban fantasy novels are set in London? Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, set in London. Rivers of London by Ben Aaronovitch, set in London. Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab, London. The Night Circus, London. Wayward, London. So why is that? Why are so many British and global authors alike choosing to set their urban fantasy novels in the city of London, where there are plenty of other, some may say more magical cities in the UK to pick from? Well, I don't know about you, but this question has been rattling around inside my mind for years, so today we're going to get to the bottom of it. So come on, fantasy writers, why London? Starting with V.E. Schwab, who wrote the Shades of Magic series. In this series, there is not one London, but 4. And the main character, Kel, is one of the only people who can travel between each of them. V.E. Schwab is American, so why does she pick London as the setting for her series? In an interview with Phoenix New Times, she said something which I think most people can agree with. Any big city with bright streets and dark alleys is great for playing with liminal space. But when you deal with a city like London, there is something about the antiquity of it. It's been built and torn down and built again to where there are hundreds of years of architectural history layered. You can be walking down a modern street and turn a corner and find yourself in an alley that hasn't changed since Elizabethan times. I wanted to pay tribute to the tradition of London as a setting for portal fantasy. London has its history stretching back to Roman times. Not only has the population of London changed significantly since then, but the makeup and general structure of London in general has changed dramatically. Unlike other historical cities like Athens or Rome, where there is an obvious patchwork of areas from different periods, London's buildings are individual structures, assembled gradually with parts from many different time periods. London was built, abandoned, and built again over hundreds of years. Each time new buildings, roads, and structures were built over the old, or simply adapted to suit its growing population. Not to mention the impact of fire, war, and destruction, which lead to even more changes. Which means there are strange layers to the city. Older buildings that still interweave with new ones, hidden passages, and older remains of structures below the streets and even under the water. This alone makes it a goldmine for urban fantasy writers. The unknown nature of London and the general makeup of the city allows writers to be really creative. They're not restricted by what actually exists. Instead, they can be creative with the potential of things that could exist or are yet to be found, all while leaning on a city that everyone has heard about. But V.E. Schwab wasn't just influenced by the makeup of London. She also drew some inspiration from another writer too, Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere is a story about the London below, an almost Alice in Wonderland for adults style world that exists below our London. I guess you could say Neverwhere was the OG London urban fantasy book because it's Neil Gaiman, but I might be biased. Neil is of course British, and while writing Neverwhere, which was originally created for a TV series for the BBC, he actually had to rewrite sections when he was writing the book to appeal to a global audience. In an interview with Writers' Right, he said, "In the English version, I could say something like, he walked down Oxford Street, and know that everybody reading my book knows that Oxford Street is a large metropolitan street in the central west end of London filled with large shops. I don't expect anybody in Kansas to know that. If somebody in Kansas read that, they might think Oxford Street. Maybe that's a street with a university on it or something. I would not make fun of that person for thinking that. They don't know, nor should they." But even though he had to change certain words and sentences and phrases to fit a global audience, London was still his choice. But why? Even if you've never been to London, you kind of know London. It's a little like if you've never been to Paris, you still kind of have an idea of what Paris would be like, mostly because you've seen it in films or heard people talk about it. It is the capital after all. But if someone were to talk about Marseille or Bordeaux, you probably wouldn't have an instant picture in your mind. Writers have to be really conscious of their location choices. If it's an urban fantasy novel, then the likelihood is it's based on a real-world location, in which case they can lean really heavily on the city itself and the fact that people already kind of know what it's like, so they don't have to describe it quite as much. But if they were to pick a less well-known city, which is totally fine, by the way, they'd have to describe a little more to give you a solid picture in your mind of what that city is like. It also goes without saying that especially global authors may have visited a capital city, but they might not have visited any of the other cities in a particular country. So if they've been to the UK, they've probably been to London, which makes it easier to write about. However, if they've not been to somewhere like Newcastle or Bristol, then they'll have a really hard time writing about that city. If a good number of urban fantasy writers have chosen London for their locations, and their books have been popular, then it goes without saying that other fantasy writers may then find inspiration in these novels and the setting of London. A little like how Paris is seen as romantic, fashionable, and a great place for food, London, through its various media representations and other books, is seen as mysterious, historical, and maybe even a little magical. If you could typecast cities, London would definitely fit this bill. But what do you think? Do you enjoy reading urban fantasy set in London, and if so, which ones? Leave them in the comments because I would love to know. Oh, and if you enjoyed this video, check out my next one on why waiting for book releases is so damn painful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.